There's a moment I keep coming back to. Not because it was dramatic. Not because anything exploded or collapsed. But because of how quiet it was, and how much I almost missed it entirely. I was standing in a grocery store on a Tuesday afternoon. Completely ordinary. I had a basket in one hand, my phone in the other, half reading a text from my sister. And there was this man in front of me at the deli counter. He was taking a long time. Asking the same question twice. Speaking slowly. And I remember the exact thought that crossed my mind. I remember it clearly now because of what happened later. I thought, this guy really doesn't have it together. That was it. That was the whole thought. 14 words. Gone in 2 seconds. I didn't say anything. I didn't do anything. I just shifted my weight to the other foot and waited. But something about that moment stayed with me. Not then. Not for a while. But it came back. And when it did, it brought a few other moments with it. And that's when I started noticing something about myself that I genuinely didn't know was there. I work in a mid-sized architecture firm. Nothing glamorous, mostly commercial projects, the kind of buildings people walk into every day without ever really looking at. I've been there almost 9 years. I know my coworkers well. I know their rhythms, their habits, their coffee orders. There's a woman I'll call Dana. She sits 2 desks down from me. We've always had what I'd call a functional relationship. Polite. Occasionally collaborative. She's good at her job. Methodical. Careful. The kind of person who triple-checks measurements and sends follow-up emails summarizing what was already said in a meeting. I always found that slightly excessive. I remember thinking, she doesn't trust anyone. Like her thoroughness was actually a character flaw, a symptom of anxiety dressed up as professionalism. That was a belief I held for years without ever examining it. I didn't think of it as a belief. I thought of it as an observation. There's a difference between those two things. I just didn't know it at the time. About 6 months ago, we were assigned to the same project. A mid-rise residential building. Tight deadline, budget constraints, the usual pressure. And I noticed something that I couldn't immediately explain. Dana kept asking questions I thought were already answered. She flagged a structural note in the drawings that everyone else had approved. She sent an email to the contractor asking for clarification on a material spec that, to me, looked perfectly clear. I'll be honest, it frustrated me. Internally. I didn't say much. But I remember thinking, why does she always have to slow things down? 3 weeks later, the contractor came back. There had been an error in that material spec. A substitution that would have failed inspection. A change that would have cost the client somewhere north of $40,000 and pushed the project back by 2 months. Dana's email had caught it. And here's what I noticed in that moment. Not the obvious thing, not oh, Dana was right. That was easy enough to process. What I noticed was the discomfort that came right after it. This quiet, uncomfortable shift inside me. Like something that had been sitting comfortably in one position had been moved without my permission. I didn't examine it then. I just said something like, "Good catch," and moved on. But it didn't move on. I started paying attention after that. Not to Dana specifically. To myself. To the small, automatic thoughts I had throughout the day, the ones that came and went so quickly I never gave them a second look. And I started noticing something that genuinely unsettled me. My mind was making judgments constantly. Not loud ones. Not the kind you'd recognize as judgments. They were more like background noise. A hum underneath everything else. The guy at the deli counter who didn't have it together. A coworker who talked too much in meetings. A neighbor who let his lawn get a little overgrown. A stranger at a coffee shop who ordered something complicated and held up the line. Each one lasted maybe 3 seconds. They were automatic. Effortless. I didn't choose them. They just appeared. And the thing that unsettled me wasn't the judgments themselves, it was how completely invisible they had been. I'd been having them for years. Probably my whole life. And I had never once sat down and looked at them. Not really. I started asking myself something I wasn't sure I wanted to answer. What else is running in the background that I haven't noticed? I called my older brother one evening. We don't talk as often as we probably should. He's a therapist, the quiet kind, the kind who listens more than he speaks. I told him what I'd been thinking about. Not looking for a session. Just talking. He said something I've thought about almost every day since. He said, the mind doesn't like uncertainty. So it fills in the gaps. Always. Whether you ask it to or not. He wasn't telling me something new, exactly. But hearing it out loud, in the context of what I'd been observing in myself, it landed differently. My mind had been filling in gaps about Dana for 9 years. A few observed behaviors, and it had quietly constructed an entire explanation. She's anxious. She doesn't trust people. She slows things down. All of that felt like knowledge. It was actually just a story I'd assembled from incomplete information and never thought to question. And the uncomfortable part, the part that kept me up a little that night, was realizing that I do this with everyone. Not maliciously. Not even consciously. My mind just does it. Automatically. Silently. And then presents the result to me as if it's been verified. There's a psychological term for this. It's called a cognitive schema. A mental shortcut. A pre-built framework your brain uses to process new information quickly. And it's not a flaw, it's actually efficient. It's one of the reasons humans can navigate complex social environments without completely short-circuiting. But here's the quiet danger in that efficiency. When a framework becomes invisible, when you stop knowing it's there, it stops being a tool. It starts being the lens through which you see everything. And lenses distort. Not dramatically. Just enough to tilt what you see a few degrees off from what's actually there. I'd been seeing Dana through a lens I didn't know I was wearing. Something shifted after that, slowly. Not in a dramatic, life-changing way. More like a recalibration. Small adjustments. I started catching the 3-second thoughts before they disappeared. Not to judge them, just to notice them. To ask, where did that come from? What am I actually working with here? The man at the deli counter came back to mind a few times. I still don't know anything about him. Maybe he was just distracted. Maybe he had a hearing issue. Maybe he was having the worst week of his life. Maybe he was completely fine and just takes his time ordering cheese. My mind had processed him in under 3 seconds and handed me a conclusion. And I had accepted it without question. That's what I'd been doing. That's what most of us do. Not out of cruelty. Not out of carelessness. Just because the mind is fast, and quiet, and confident, and it doesn't come with a visible menu that shows you everything it's running in the background. I had a conversation with Dana a few weeks ago. Actual conversation, not project logistics, not email threads. We were both staying late, the office was mostly empty, and we ended up talking for almost an hour. I found out she grew up in a family where mistakes were expensive. Not in a dramatic way, just in a quiet, accumulated way. A parent who struggled financially. A household where one missed step could mean a real problem. She didn't describe it as trauma. She described it as just the way things were. And somewhere in that upbringing, she learned to check things twice. To follow up. To make sure. The thing I had called excessive caution, the thing I had quietly filed under "she doesn't trust anyone," was actually something that made complete sense. Something reasonable, even admirable, once I had more than 3 seconds of information. I didn't say any of this to her. It wasn't that kind of conversation. But I thought about it on the drive home. I thought about how confidently I had misread her. Not with malice. Not even with awareness. Just with the quiet efficiency of a mind doing what minds do, summarizing, categorizing, moving on. I don't think the answer is to slow down every interaction and interrogate every automatic thought. That's not realistic, and honestly it sounds exhausting. But I do think there's something worth sitting with here. The mind is constantly working. Constantly interpreting, predicting, filling in gaps. And most of that work happens below the surface, in places we don't think to look, in processes we've never been introduced to, running conclusions we never consciously authorized. And most of the time, we take those conclusions at face value. We receive them like facts. Like observations. When really, they're more like rough drafts. Written fast, without full information, by a part of us that prioritizes speed over accuracy. What would change, not dramatically, just quietly, if we started treating those conclusions as drafts? If we left a little more room for revision? I think about that sometimes. Not in a heavy way. Just as a question I keep in my back pocket. Because the quiet things your mind does, the ones you've never once noticed, they're not always wrong. But they're not always complete either. And maybe that's the most important thing to know about yourself. Not as a flaw to fix. Just as a fact to hold.